Why do we keep repeating the same mistakes even when we know better? I sat down with Will Rezin and he blew my mind with how trauma and our nervous system shapes so much of what we do, even when we think we've moved on. We dove into how to break free from old patterns, what it really means to be self-aware, and why slowing down might be the key to real change. This conversation completely shifted how I think about personal growth, and it's one I'll be reflecting on for a long time. Welcome to Seekers and Shifters, where we talk to the world's foremost experts in personal growth and development and ask them everything we really want to know. Hey there, Seekers and Shifters. It is your host, Michelle, and I am here with my brand new friend, Will Rezin. Thank you for being with us. Will, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, my name's Will Rezin. Introduce myself. Yeah, it's what's funny is that depending on where I am in my life, I introduce myself a little bit differently. For those of you that want to hear the definition that I use professionally, I'm a somatic coach, somatic experiencing practitioner. I'm a trauma educator, and those are the things that are the umbrella terms that I use to describe the work that I do in the world professionally. But beyond that, I'm a mystic. I'm a philosopher. And I've been infinitely curious about what makes life do what it does. How do we wake ourselves up? How do we come into contact with the richness of being alive? And I found my way into the field of somatics accidentally. I think it's a beautiful umbrella term that describes a holistic approach to working with a whole human. But my interest has been far more philosophical, or you could even say metaphysical at times, over the years. Even though right now I do a lot of teaching about science, nervous system physiology, psychological theory, and all sorts of different things.
Can we start there? Because there's a lot of interesting things that you just said. But one of the things that just popped out for me is we talk about this, and there's some presupposition in the language sometimes, like mystic and science are two separate things. I know you don't think that. I know that you know that they're the same thing. I always have come from this place of, well, we can't know all the science, right? So even when there are things that we can't explain logically, or that science hasn't already explained us or taught us, that doesn't mean that there's not a scientific explanation for some of these phenomena that we experience. And so when you talk about mysticism, and when you talk about, well, I teach it from a science lens, can you tell us a little more how you marry those things?
Mm-hmm, yeah. My interest in what has turned into personal development started with an exploration of culture and religion. And that led me, I'm the kind of person that I'll read something, and then the author will reference people who influenced them, and I will then go read their work, and they'll reference the people who influenced them, and I'll go read their work, and so on and so forth down the line. This started back in 98, 99. And really before that, as a child, I've been fascinated with culture. But around 98, 2000, I started branching out from my traditional Christian upbringing and became really curious about cultures and religions and other traditions. And those traditions led me on this winding path to see the similarity or the congruence between many different traditions on our planet over the years. I discovered Joseph Campbell's work and Carl Jung's work way back then, and started exploring dreams, and then became fascinated with more of the esoteric teachings, or sometimes referred to as occult teachings. And really that just means hidden. Even Rudolf Steiner's work was considered occult work back then. I say back then, but early 1900s or whatever it was when he was around. But it's so far away from what we think of when we think of the occult. We often think about dark magicians or somebody like Aleister Crowley, these people that are a little bit scary. But really, more than anything, they were seekers that live on the edge of science and spirituality. And in this world, in this like gray zone, alchemy is just chemistry, but with these other myths kind of attached to it. And so I started reading about these things, learning about them, practiced a little bit of some of them, and I began to see the golden thread that connects all these different cultures. And I was like, man, well, what is this? This is really interesting. These people who are separated by thousands of miles on these different cultures on the planet, seemingly having similar kinds of insights, using different cultural contexts to describe it. But nonetheless, it's very, very similar. What's that about? And I became fascinated with the origin point of some of the Abrahamic religions and monotheistic religions, and then polytheistic religions. And inside of those, there are these different like development processes. For instance, the Christian mystics have their way of cultivating self-awareness or awareness or connection to God. The Hebrew mystics or the Kabbalists have their approach to connecting with the infinite. The Eastern mystics have their approach to connecting with the infinite. And many of these require certain forms of ritual or practice. And I found that as my fascination pulled me forward into psychology and physiology and things like that, there's this beautiful overlay between the culture that has myth associated with why we do what we do, and then our modern culture, which is just science-based. The myths are science now instead of some deity. And so when I talk about being a mystic or philosopher, or esoteric teachings, what I'm really referring to is my fascination with these myths that carry across time and how they influence us, our worldview, some of our behavior, our sense of self. And that can be seen in the way that we may label different people using psychology. And modern neurophysiology is pointing at the same thing that ancient Buddhists understood. It was implicit in those teachings many, many years ago. And now we're finding the overlap, or I'm seeing the overlap at least, between these modern scientific understandings and the practices, nervous system regulation practices. Yeah, the Hindus and the Vedics were doing those things thousands of years ago.
Yeah, I'm always struck by, and I'll use the strong words, but the arrogance behind the thought that modern science is what has all the answers. And when we look in the past and we do see all of these separate cultures that were all over the world, completely had no ways of communicating with each other, coming up with similar concepts, to me, it starts to point to something closer to capital T truth. You know, I don't know if there is such a thing as capital T truth, but if there were, to me, the evidence is compelling that these people come up with all these things. And now we're kind of backing in and saying, okay, well, now we're figuring out how to explain that in our frame, in our time, with our culture, in the ways that folks will understand and accept here, because in our current culture, nobody's going to accept, you know, oh, this was the sign from the sky, or the mountain said this to me, or you know, the things that were accepted in other cultures. So I find that interesting. And I think, you know, to go back to this identity conversation, I've been struggling with the same thing. When people say, what do you do? You know, even like the conference we met at, people, what do you do? And I'm like, what do I say now to this person? Because it depends on the context in which we're talking. But the answer is, I'm a student eternally. I'm a seeker. The reason this is called Seekers and Shifters, the reason we have, you know, Seekers Club is, hey, we're seekers, we're explorers, we're looking. And I don't think that's a satisfactory answer for people, like in a professional context, which is why we struggle to come up with, well, I do this, I do this, and I do this. I do this for money, right? But the core identity here is one of knowing less the further you go down the path. And that's at odds with how we are expected to present ourselves as experts.
Well said. Well said. It is the awareness that we know less and less and less the more we learn and the more we grow. Oh, I'm now aware of my ignorance. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And professionally, that's not our culture. Our culture is not to present that first. Our culture is to present the things that we're good at, the things that we've succeeded at, you know, to place ourselves up on some sort of stage of sorts to say, look at me, look at my accomplishments. And, you know, I could have led with, these are the accomplishments. These are the people I've served. These are the results they've had in their lives. But that for me doesn't really define who I am or what I do. Right. I agree with I love that frame. I'm a seeker. Yeah. I often say that I'm infinitely curious, constantly exploring what makes life life, what makes me me. That there's a Zen koan, which is, essentially, I'm sure you may know what this means, but for the listener, in case you don't, a koan is essentially a question that a Zen teacher may ask a disciple or a student. And then they're supposed to just sit with that question over and over again and ponder it, right? So I often live my life by this question, which is, who is behind the me? Who's behind my personality, right? Who is I, right? And from a more Eastern philosophical standpoint, there's me, which is my body, my personality, the who I think I might be. But then there's the watcher that's watching me. There's something else inside that was present from the moment that I was born, that is still present today and will be present all the way throughout my life until I cease to be a human anymore, right? Until my body expires. That's watching. Who is the one that hears the thought? It's like, I'm not the thought. I'm something that's witnessing the thought. So what is that? And so when people say, who are you? What do you do? I often chuckle inside because I'm like, well, I can define all these things, but that's not really defining the essence. I'm in the I don't know, in that exploration of what is it that's happening inside.
If I'm being flip, I'll say I contain multitudes, or, I'm an alien of some sort, I think, but we'll figure it out. I want to ask you, because you do have this trauma background, and you are a trauma educator. And one of the things that when we hear a lot about when we talk about trauma is parts, and how parts form in response to trauma. And so I want to ask you about parts in relation to what you just said. There's an observer, and then there's the part, in my understanding, that's generating the thought. How does that reconcile with parts and with trauma?
Yeah, I think you described it really well. Dick Schwartz, I think, discovered in his work that when we think about ourselves, we often think about ourselves like there are these many selves, like many us, like multiple voices or multiple characters. Right? I inhabit myself in this one way in this particular scenario, and then as soon as I'm out of that scenario, I'm thinking differently and being differently and holding my body differently, right? And trauma fractures or fragments us in a way. Right. And that is we can become compartmentalized. We can become cut off from some sort of sensory experience, some sort of memory. And that all is an adaptive strategy to get through something that was too big or too overwhelming or too hard for us to process. And so this, the mystic or the philosopher or these more conceptual frameworks that I was discussing, sure, you could think about them as parts. In fact, somebody who heavily inspired Alan Watts and Eckhart Tolle, Gurdjieff is his name, George Ivanovich Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff influenced a wide variety of thinkers. He was definitely similar kind of thinker to Rudolf Steiner, but also really inspired by Eastern mysticism, Vajrayana Buddhism specifically, I think. But he discusses it as though there are over 1,000 of you in you at any time. And what he correlates it to is there's the bacterial fluctuation in your body. There are the cells, there are the hormones, there are all the variety of different ways that our body is expressing or interpreting sensory input throughout a given day. Most of the time, 99.9% of the time, we're unaware of all of these things that are going on and the way that they influence how we be in the moment. They influence how we think, they influence how we respond, they influence the imagery that we hold about ourselves, right? So I could show up today and be in less of a confident position. I could be in, this self-doubt, and it would ring through in the way that I use language, and it would show in my body posture, right? And that would be a result of this whole constellation of things. So if my gut bacteria is off, that's going to influence how I'm thinking. It's also going to influence my hormone production and neurotransmitters and all sorts of other things. So yes, to what you're saying, we have these different expressions of us. We could think about them as different parts. It's a wonderful thought experiment or framework for thinking about the different compulsions that we may have. And trauma, as we think about it or define it nowadays, is that which cuts us off or severs us or fractures some sort of part of us in an effort to survive. Right? It's that which is too much, and it's that which lives on as this reaction to the world to attempt to keep us safe. Dr. Gabor Mate says, trauma is not what happens to us, it's what happens inside of us in response to what happens to us. Right? And so I correlate that also to the discussion around the Buddhist philosophy of attachment. I think we don't have the cultural context to understand a lot of those teachings nowadays, but that which keeps us stuck in the past is the same as what we refer to now as trauma, especially from a more nervous system physiology standpoint. It is the living memory of some moment that continues on inside of us, and that can show up as habituated body patterns. It can show up as certain thinking patterns. It can show up as muscular contraction or a lack of sensory awareness in different parts of our bodies. And there's so many different ways, and that prevents us from really being fully present in the moment, in this moment right now. That is also one of the things that sets us apart from other, wild animals. Things just occur and then they go away. They're living mostly in the present moment, with the exception of domesticated creatures. And we're passing on our sickness to them, I think, if I could say it in that way. It's a sickness in some ways, but it's also a gift in others, right? The expansion of the neocortex, like this part of our brain that allows us to be self-aware, self-referencing. That's a wonderful thing for us to have. And there's also this double-edged sword where it can become this thing that prevents us from really being fully present in our bodies, in our environment, and with each other.
Yeah, it depends on the day. It depends on who you ask. Do you want to be self-aware today? Some days I would say, you know what? It might be nice to be a deer in the woods and forget what happened yesterday. Start over again. But here we are. Something that came up for me just now as you were talking was in the personal growth and development space that you and I both operate in. We have lots of friends that operate in this space. What we see is people attempting to take more and more control over these 1,000 variables, right? And you see this too, right? We see people really taking control of their health, really strictly managing their diet, managing their exercise, managing their sleep, their morning routine. Biohacking is a big thing. I've been really nerding out on my continuous glucose monitor, really, really excited about biohacking. And isn't that just another form of trying to control or trying to attach to an outcome? And look, I'm guilty too. I'm doing it all the time, right? But how do we reconcile? Okay, we're getting to know ourselves, and we're trying to manage these variables we're trying to control maybe the uncontrollable.
Yeah, I think it's this beautiful little dance that we do with ourselves. I think there's benefit to that. What we are kind of referencing here, calling self-control. There's benefit to being able to direct our biological impulses to a degree. Because then we're less at the whim of them. The danger comes when we think that means that we're in charge. Right? Yes, we're directing our behavior. Yes, that has a downstream effect on how we feel and how we move through the world. But let's not confuse ourselves and think that means that our thought has some sort of rulership over our biological functioning. The body does what it wants to do to keep us alive. It does what it needs to do to keep us alive and keep us functioning. Now, we do have rational thought. We can direct it, but it will always win. And we see this with traumatic experiences or like high stress experiences where the body just reacts. Where there's a threat. The person becomes kind of frozen or dissociated or numb. They can't react. They're stuck. Or somebody just has a moment of an outburst of what we call anger, the survival response to self-protect. Right? That's not a thing that we think about. It's a thing that just happens through us. Now, we can set up circumstances where we practice certain things that help us to be less driven by those impulses. But ultimately, those impulses are there to keep us alive. They're actually quite great. So I like to think about When I'm working with clients, some people will say, well, what can I do? What are some assignments? What are some ways that I can control myself? And I'll say, well, notice yourself. Let's start by becoming aware of all the impulses that we have, the compulsions to do this or to do that. And it's through a process of becoming aware that we can then begin to direct our responses to things. But if I'm not aware of it, then there's no way I can change it. And my body can't learn the skills to do it differently. Now, we can train ourselves to respond differently to situations, but that also requires that we get to know all of where those reactions are coming from, right? What am I reenacting as I'm moving through the world? So many of us have no idea what it is that we're reenacting. Like, we think about the word reacting, acting something out yet again. And that happens when we're triggered in a moment. And the trigger is some sort of memory that's surfacing in our system where our body goes, this is the same as that one time. And then we attempt to behave in a way that's similar to that, whatever got us through this stressful experience, even though that there's an incongruence between the moments. So helping ourselves to become aware of all of that then allows that to translate into a change of behavior gradually over time.
Yeah.
One of the analogies that I really like to use when I'm teaching and when I'm working with clients is changing our behavior is like exercise. I'm not going to go in to a gym and expect that I'm going to have a total body transformation in 30 days. I'm going to expect that it's good. I mean, maybe I am, but I'm going to be sorely disappointed if I go in there expecting to have a total body transformation in 30 days. Especially as we age, right? I'm 42 and my body does not change near as fast as it did when I was 18 or 20. But we're going to expect that with progressive, consistent effort, our bodies are going to learn different things. Our patterns are going to change. Our muscles are going to develop. Our movement patterns are going to become different, right? We may end up with more range of motion or mobility, but those are things that happen progressively over long periods of time. And unless we're using drugs, some sort of synthetic substance to force the body to change really quickly. And working with behavior is far more subtle than exercise is, because we have to change these impulses, these habituated responses that come up in ourselves. And so there is an equation. The equation is consistently apply small amounts of effort, finding where the edge of our tolerance for it is, and just progressively load more and more and more and more and more challenge, but not all the challenge at once. Otherwise, our system doesn't develop.
Yeah, 100%. And even, somebody like James Clear is going to teach us, right? Like little bit at a time with our habit building. I want to go back to something you said about reenactment, because a lot of folks are familiar with this concept through traditional therapy. They start to think of it in terms of, oh, why do I keep dating the same types of people over and over that are bad for me? And then they start to get to this level of, oh, I'm reenacting something from my childhood. And they get to it from that cognitive behavioral therapy sense. And then a lot of times they'll stop there, or they'll just keep going with that. And it's what you're talking about, you're trying to control with your mind or with your conscious mind, something that's actually enacting unconsciously and something that is often stored or lives in your body. So how do you start to move the people you work with from that cognitive frame, many of whom I'm sure have been in therapy for years before they come to you, or concurrently, right, into, okay, well, let's figure out what's happening in your body. Let's start to shift it unconsciously. Like you said, let's try to shift it a little bit at a time. Because of course everyone wants to I'm going to change and I'm going to just do it. I'm going to just date the opposite person. By the way, that doesn't go well, right? I married somebody once and then got divorced and then married the opposite person, got divorced again. That reactive doesn't work. We want the middle. We want the balance. How do you start to approach that with people who want to fix it now?
Yeah, well, I've had a number of clients come to me with this exact thing. Like, okay, I want it, I want it to be fixed now. And where I always start with people is the setting of the expectation that this is something that progressively takes time. And the analogy of exercise is a really easy to understand analogy, because it points at the thing, which is we need to do this consistently over time. And then where I like to start is with self-awareness building. So people's degree of self-awareness, body awareness, mind awareness, thought awareness, action awareness, so on and so forth, is everybody's a little bit different. Some people have practice. They've done this a lot. Some people have no practice and need to build a practice of sorts so that they can notice themselves. We start there. And then what I'm paying attention to with them is, what are the subtle unconscious things that we can, it's more than bring awareness to, but work with. Oh, look, my,
Your thumbs up.
that is funny.
I'm telling you, we were just talking before we started about how we're getting a little middle-aged and we're not as tech savvy as we used to be. Like, it's always doing something.
Yep. Well, apparently this feature on Mac has to be turned off on every different app, so it's off now. But that was hilarious.
If you're listening, just the automatic thumbs up bubble that just came up on the screen. Yeah. That's what's making a very serious point, and it's like a cartoon thumbs up is floating around.
So good. So good. Yeah. Well, the body is going to give messages. It's going to show me, at least, some of the things that the individual is probably not aware of. So gradually and slowly, we're working with what the individual can notice, and also working with those impulses in the body. And so the brilliance of some of the techniques that I've learned over the years is that we can work with that, what we might think about as unconscious, but it's more of impulse, reaction, sensory kind of, like the autonomic nervous system, for instance, right? It's the automatic nervous system. It just automatically behaves. And so my objective with people is to work subtly enough that the behavior automatically changes, and then they catch it after and go, oh my God, it's changing. What just happened? So it's that soft and subtle, although that can sometimes come along with these really big insights and experiences that are totally transformational. But many people have this expectation, I just want to fix the thing and move on. And usually what I work on with people with that kind of mindset is, we just need to let go. Here's a way of framing it. If we reject the part of ourselves that we don't like, then that part of ourselves becomes projected into others, because we're not acknowledging that it's present in ourselves. And this is something that Jung talked about, Carl Jung. We don't want to eradicate our shadow, the parts of us that we don't like. Those parts are important. The contrast of these two parts is just absolutely important. And so there are so many ways that our mind relates to ourselves that involve judgment. That judgment leads to shame. Shame prevents us from acknowledging what's present in us, which then causes that projecting of that out onto the world. And so as we're getting closer and closer to the parts of ourselves that we don't like, we got to work more and more with those layers of judgment so that we can tolerate them. But once we get over that hump and we can tolerate seeing ourselves exactly as we are, then we can begin. And the change can begin to take place. Oh yeah, I do that thing. Oh, that is part of me. And it's not a bad part. It's a part I don't like. And I have this habit of placing lots of judgment on myself, which then leads to feeling ashamed. Oh my goodness, there's my loop.
Yep.
Oh, I can shift that loop.
Yeah. And the irony of that is that it can be an instantaneous shift once you're ready to let it go. Once you're ready to move it. Once the unconscious brings it up and says, okay, I'm okay. I'm okay to shift this. I'm okay to let it go. We can shift it like that. But sometimes getting to that point, depending on what it's been through, right, can take a longer time. I'm interested because I just, I train entrepreneurs. That's one of my million identities, right? And sometimes we get into businessy stuff here. You've got quite a following, right? You're a marketer of sorts. I know that might not be your number one identity, but clearly you're good at it. What we do and what you're just talking about and what marketing wants us to say sometimes are two separate things. Marketing pressure, my experience is, and what people want to hear, again, my projection, I can fix you immediately. I can fix you, you're going to make $1 million from talking to me. That actually might be true, right? Depending on who you are, what you come with, where you're at. And we're supposed to just make these claims when in reality, there's a lot more nuance. Some people are going to need a lot more work than others. Some people are going to come ready to shift. Some people need to do the work to get ready to shift. Some people aren't ready to do the work at all. How do you speak with authenticity to the nuance of the process and become such an amazing marketer at the same time?
It's a really good question. It's an inquiry I've been in for many, many years. Gosh, probably the last 10 years. How do we point at the thing without getting too caught up in the minutia of how we get there when we talk about it to people, without overselling ourselves as well? And I can talk about the results that my clients have gotten. I can meet with a person and I have a consultation of sorts and say, yes, I could potentially help you. Then what I often offer is, it depends on you. The results are going to be entirely dependent on you. Like, I cannot guarantee those results because I can't force you to change. So that's not really answering your question. If we come around to the question of, how do we reconcile these two? When I'm marketing, I speak very differently than when I'm interacting with a potential client. In my interaction with a potential client, there is an investigation of sorts that I'm doing. I'm asking questions, I'm building rapport, and I don't think about these things. I can self-reflect and reference them right now, but it's an unconscious competence at this point. But there's a discussion. Is it human to human? Tell me what's going on in your life, and I'm going to listen. And I listen, I ask more questions, and usually there's some sort of insight that comes from the conversation, and I say, I can help you, or I'm not the best person to help you. I mean, at this point, I'm comfortable enough with what I can do that I'm pretty clear really quickly whether I can or I can't help. And then the next discussion that follows is, does this person want to spend the money to get out of their discomfort or to achieve the big vision that they have for their life? Did you and I talk about marketing to pain versus marketing to possibility?
We did a little bit in our first conversation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is something that I learned. Well, this is something I've always intuitively done, but there's a guy who I read a book from, two, Steve Chandler and Rich Litvin. The Prosperous Coach was the book, and that connected me with this community of really interesting thinkers. And I love Rich's philosophy, which is build relationships. And I know that came from Steve Chandler's work. And Steve Chandler was involved in sales many, many, many years ago. And he's been a sales trainer and then moved on to coaching. But what I love about Steve's work is that it's entirely relationship based. And I think the foundation for us as human beings of most of life is relationships. And so when we put the relationship first, then the process of what's often called enrollment is no longer enrollment. It's listening, talking, and relationship building. And that flipped it for me so that I began to think, okay, well, I could market to the pain. I could talk about the pain the person's in. I could get really good at talking about the pain, but I don't live in a world where I'm oriented to pain. I live in a world where I'm oriented to possibility. And Tony Robbins talks about this. He says, some people are, they're focusing on the pain. Some people are focusing on the possibility. And people have a bias towards one or the other. We want to understand, and we can listen to the way a person talks about something. Are they talking about the difficulty they're in and how they want to get out of it? Are they talking about where they want to go and just how excited they are? Are they motivated by one or the other? I found that if I talk about where we're going and I understand the direction that my customer wants to go, if I understand it well enough and describe it well enough, the people who are oriented in that direction come and find me. And I find that I'm happier working with those people.
Absolutely.
Because they genuinely want that transformation. They genuinely want the change. They're seeking that in their lives as opposed to being stuck in something. Now, it's not to say they're not stuck in something. Their orientation is different. And so how I reconcile this in the marketing space is I point more towards where we're headed and less towards the difficulty that the person's in.
There was the old school way that marketing was taught, and especially online marketing, was, okay, well, you need to show them that you understand the pain they're in by talking about the pain and then bringing in the move toward. But you're right. a lot of times that's going to attract people that are stuck in pain. And then you end up in conversations with people who aren't ready to shift. And look, no judgment from me on that. There have been plenty of times in my life that I wasn't ready to hear something or ready to take action on it. Sometimes it's just not a big priority. It can be a pain point without being a priority. And that's maybe sometimes what frustrates us as helpers is we want it to be a priority, but we can't want it to be a priority more than it is a priority. And isn't it wonderful to work with these people who are moved toward, as we say, people who are in possibility? When I'm training an entrepreneur who is got a big vision, something I would never think of, this is my favorite, right? I'm a strategy person. I can tell you how to do anything you want to do, but I'm probably not going to come up with that huge vision that this person comes to me with. So my very favorite people are saying, I have no idea how I'm going to do this, but this is what I see and this is what I'm getting. And sometimes they even speak about it like a psychic transmission. This is what's dropped in for me. And this is how do I do it? Right? Favorite. Because now you feel like you're on a mission from God or the universe or spirit or however you interpret it. And the how part becomes really, really easy when you're anchored in like that with your mindset and your soul, your heart, your passion, your mind is all going in the same direction toward, I know this is going to happen. When we talk to people that are coming from the opposite place, they almost can't get to the vision. It almost starts with well, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? But if I do this, then this is going to happen. If I do that, then that's going to happen. And there's that loop that you talk about that happens with entrepreneurs, right? And at a certain point we say, okay, look, we're either going to stop the loop and we're going to shift what needs to shift to get you out of the loop and get you on the path, or it's not a priority for you, which is okay, because a lot of times when we're holding on to baggage, and I just want to say this for anybody watching or listening so that, it's okay. But if you feel yourself stuck like that, holding on to baggage, there's a fear underneath that. There's a fear that says, I'm not safe if I let this go. What happens if I let this go? Who am I without this? When you start to really identify with it, this is who I am. Who am I without this? And to just start with that noticing, start with that observation of, why do I want to hold on to this so much? And see what comes up, because it's interesting. It's something to explore, right?
Yeah. I often will say, look for the way that this is serving you.
Yeah.
This is a support. It helps something. Like we get something from these things. And then if that's where you find yourself, then how do I have a little less discomfort is the question. It's not how do I create this big vision. It's how do I reduce the pain just a little bit more? Right? Start there, because that's going to lead you to a place where eventually you'll build that internal capacity to be able to orient differently towards something more. Trauma leaves this imprint or this energy or the signature, so to speak, in personality structure, especially early developmental trauma, where the thinking processes that we have, so our thought structure is going to be more centered around how do I want to feel less pain. I want to feel less discomfort, because that's been consistently there most of life. It's a perfectly natural orientation to the world. And it's not somewhere we're stuck. It's just what is now. And so the gradual movement is away from the pain until the system stabilizes enough that the shift can occur.
We have to be safe. We have to feel safe on a level before anything can shift, and before big inspiration drops in. And we've got people that are holding on and saying, where's my big idea? Where's my big, when they haven't done the release first. And it's first we release and then we set goals, because otherwise we're setting goals from a misaligned place. We're setting fragmented place, and I see this all the time, right, in businesses, and we'll call it like building a business on your baggage, where you can actually get to a certain point just out of move away from energy. Maybe some people do it out of spite, for instance. That's a common one. I'll show my parents or my in-laws or whatever it is, and I'm, look how successful I can be. And you'll get to a point where you build something, maybe it's even making a couple $1 million a year or something like that. And you go, oh my God, I actually hate my business. I hate the people who work here. I hate what we do. And now I'm trapped in it because the only way to get out of it is to lay off 50 people. We don't want to do that. We got to clear it out first. There's a process. So how do we talk to people and say, and this is the last question, right? But how do you communicate to folks out there and say, on a marketing level, it's going to be slow, maybe. This may be years worth of work. These are not sexy marketing messages, Will. Nobody puts up an Instagram that says, it might take years.
Yeah, well, that's part of the consultative process that I go through with people.
Get them on the phone first and tell them it might take years.
Well, people come to me because usually they're referred by somebody. The students come through social media, but the clients usually come from referral. And the work that I do is super deep. And so it takes a specific kind of person to be ready to say, I want to spend $100,000 and spend a year with you. That is a very specific person. And that means that it's not a lot of people. It is a certain demographic of person that says, I'm ready. I don't care what it costs. I know that you can help me. Tell me where to begin. Right. And they could be in pain and they could be searching for possibility. But the discussion is almost always, here's how we work. Here's how this works. Let's set expectations, because you may have a massive breakthrough on week 3 that changes the trajectory of your whole life, but you may not have any breakthrough for the first 8 months. It may just be us sifting through these stacking layers of habits or habitual, living, so to speak. The mind, the body, all the different layers of things. But at some point, there will be a tipping point. What I find is it's usually around the 6-month mark when we meet consistently every week. It's usually about the 6-month point where something massive shifts in the individual. We have had enough time in relationship with each other to build the trust necessary to do the deeper work. But also I've had people where just 2 sessions and their entire reality shifted. I've incorporated the somatic experiencing work that I'm trained in into the work that I do. And that is a profound model to work with. I mean, it's absolutely profound. And it does not need to be applied just to doing trauma work. We can apply it to just about any different scenario. And it's extraordinary. But I've seen massive changes in people from just a couple sessions. But that doesn't mean that life changes all of a sudden. Now we bring containment and consistency across time. And then to change the fundamental nature of who we are and how we be requires so much comprehensive work. So you're kind of getting some of my sales pitch right now, which is, look, you want to be a different person. Great. You want to have a different life. Great. I can help you get there, but it's going to take time. And how long it takes is dependent entirely on you. And in the beginning, people are like, yeah, I'm going to show up. I'm going to do the thing. Great. I believe you. And let's just see what happens. Because in 6 months, that enthusiasm, when you bump up against the things that are the hardest for you to come into contact with, that enthusiasm is going to wane. And then we want to be together in that, because that is the moment when everything can change. When we really get into that sticky gunk, so to speak. Just to give you some idea, I mean, I've had clients that this one woman I spent almost 2 years working with her. And within the first year, we were mostly working on interpersonal stuff. But then at around the year mark, we shifted our focus, because we had that foundation built, to work, to apply some of that to her international consulting company. And it went from interpersonal work that was rippling out into the way that she was showing up in the world to her brokering a $1 billion deal between massive companies. And that was a huge thing for her. And that skyrocketed a change in career for her. And then we didn't focus anymore on that. We focused more on the interpersonal. That was the crux for all of it. And so doing that deeper inner work made it possible for her to do this thing that was extraordinary in her life and build a multinational consultancy agency and a bunch of other businesses and write some books and all these other things while traveling to 72 different countries. We could talk about those results. And one of the things that I find really interesting about Rich Litvin is that he doesn't talk about his process at all. He talks about his clients and he talks about the results that they've gotten, which is great for enrolling a person and wanting to get those results. But to the point that we're discussing here, we also, for me, I think it's an integrity to be honest about the journey, which is, yeah, this is hard. It requires work. I'm not afraid to say it's hard. Let's be real. It's uncomfortable at times. In fact, it's like exercise in that we're building the capacity to be with something that's really hard and really uncomfortable. And we honestly don't want to do it, which is why we haven't until now.
100%. And gosh, well, I could talk to you for hours and we'll have to have you back on at one point. But yes, let's leave it there. That's where the magic happens, is in that point where you hit up against the discomfort and you can keep going. If you resonate with Will, if you want to learn more about him, if you're one of those people that he's talking about that wants to spend $100,000 in a year with Will, really diving into your stuff, where can we find you, Will?
Instagram's a great place to find me, at Will Rezin, Rezin. And then I run a training company that teaches nervous system physiology, trauma-informed care, and somatics. It's called Trauma and Somatics. So it's at Trauma and Somatics on Instagram, and it's traumaandsomatics.com. My website's willrezin.com. You can email me, will@willrezin.com. And something fun, by the time this airs, we will have already been, well, if it's in the first week of August, we'll just have to see when this airs. Depending on when this airs, you may be able to get into a couple of the different programs that we're launching right now. Is it okay if I talk about that real quick, Michelle?
Yeah. We just got to keep to time here.
Perfect. So I won't be long. We're launching 3 additional trainings. Right now we have our flagship trauma-informed care training, and we're launching one on attachment and one on spirituality. And then there's a men's group that's launching as well. And so we're expanding our offerings in really cool ways.
We got to do a whole other episode where we just talk about the men. I want to dive all the way into that with you too. For now, all of that will be in the show notes if you want to find Will, and please do reach out to this amazing guy. Thank you so much, Will, for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michelle.